Hello and welcome to the final summary of the Dune series. This is Dune Book 8, also written by Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson, Sandworms of Dune. I didn't mention this in my previous video, but Book 7 was to me the worst of the lot. It's basically just a build-up to Book 8, and because everything that has ever happened in almost every single Dune book is recapped in Book 8, I did not see the point of Book 7. To be fair, I'm still considering reading the prequels. I don't know if it's going to be a worthwhile endeavor, but we'll see. Anyway, that's enough from me. Onto the video. On board the Ithaca, the 14-year-old Lady Jessica Gola witnesses the birth of her daughter Alia, who was being extracted from an Axetal tank. Jessica doesn't have any memories of when the first Alia was born. All she had were images from her studies, a dry and dusty siege on Arrakis, surrounded by Fremen. Jessica and her son Paul had been on the run, taken in by the desert tribe. Duke Leto was dead, murdered by the Harkonnens. Pregnant, Jessica had drunk the water of life, forever changing the fetus inside her. From the moment of her birth, the original Alia had been different from all other babies, filled with ancient wisdom and madness, able to tap into other memory without having gone through the spice agony. Abomination. By the way, Paul, Chaney, and their son, Leto II, are there in this birthing chamber as well. The Bene Gesserit Order had resurrected these figures from history to help fight against the terrible outside enemy that hunted them. They had Tufir Hawat, the planetologist Liet Kynes, the Fremen leader Stilgar, and even the notorious Dr. Yui. Now, after almost a decade of hiatus in the Gola program, Alia had joined the group. Others would come soon. The 3 remaining Axetal tanks were already pregnant with new children: Gurney Halleck, Serena Butler, and Xavier Harkonnen. The rabbi still finds this resurrecting Golas project distressing, and he vents his frustration to Shayana, asking her when they'll stop taunting God. After receiving an ominous prescient dream, Shayana had declared a temporary moratorium on the Gola project that had been her passion from its inception. But their recent ordeal on the planet of the Handlers and their near capture by the enemy hunters had forced Shayana to reassess that decision. The wealth of historical and tactical experience the reawakened Golas could offer might be the greatest weapon the no-ship possessed. Shayana had decided to take the risk. Meanwhile, things aren't going well for the computer Evermind. Duncan Idaho continued to elude Ominous and Erasmus, who repeatedly cast their sparkling tachyon net into the nothingness, searching for their quarry. The no-ship's veiling capability normally prevented it from being seen, but from time to time the pursuers caught glimpses, as of something concealed behind shrubbery. At first the hunt had been a challenge, but now the Evermind was growing frustrated. With the launch of the machine fleet, the long foretold Krasilek had begun at last. Krasilek, Armageddon, the battle at the end of the universe, Ragnarok, Azraphel, the end times, the cloud darkness. It was a time of fundamental change, of the entire universe shifting on its cosmic axis. Human legends had predicted such a cataclysmic event since the dawn of civilization. Indeed, they had already been through several iterations of similar cataclysms: the Butlerian Jihad itself, Jihad of Paul Muad'Dib, the reign of the tyrant Leto II. Ominous also knows that the Kwisatz Haderach is on the no-ship, and he wants it on their side. All this time though, while they're pursuing the no-ship, the Evermind and its fleet of thinking machines are crushing the humans and taking over their planets one by one. Erasmus thinks about the Butler family who ruled for 10,000 years under House Corrino after the Battle of Corrin. He also thinks of Leto II, called the God Emperor or Tyrant. Another Kwisatz Haderach, a unique hybrid of man and sandworm, had imposed a draconian rule for 3,500 years. After his assassination, human civilization fragmented, fleeing to the far reaches of the galaxy and the scattering. People became hardened by their privations until the worst sort of humans, Honored Matres, had blundered into the burgeoning machine empire. On Chapter House, Mubella is talking strategy for the coming war. Her plan is to disperse decoy Shayanas to the refugee world to recruit and strengthen their ranks. The 12 Shayanas will carry spice from our stockpiles. Each will distribute extravagant amounts of melange as she makes her pronouncements. She will say that Shaitan told her in a dream that spice will flow again soon. Though Arrakis was burned as lifeless as Sodom and Gomorrah, many new dunes will appear elsewhere. Shayana will promise them this. We take advantage of the superstitions that will run rampant. People believe they must endure a time of tribulation, so we tailor that belief to our own uses. The thinking machines are the great evil we have to defeat before humanity can reap its reward. A Talaxu master on a guild highline designer is having WAF work on creating melange by somehow bringing back sandworms that had been exterminated on Arrakis. He does have sandworms in his lab. Years ago, the guild had intercepted a secret Bene Gesserit ship carrying sand trout in its hold. When the witches aboard refused to explain their mission, they were all killed, their sand trout seized, and Chapter House had been none the wiser. Learning that the guild possessed some of the immature sandworm vectors, WAF demanded them for his work. Though he could not remember how to create melange and axetal tanks, this experiment had much greater potential. By resurrecting the worms, he could not only bring back spice, but the prophet himself. He theorizes that perhaps he could develop a breed of worm that could tolerate water so they wouldn't need the specific desert conditions of Dune. Remember, water is poisonous to sandworms. On the no ship, Scytale is still degenerating while he teaches his 12-year-old Gola child the Tlaxu ways. When the young Gola memories can be unlocked, then Scytale can finally allow himself to die. 17-year-old Baron Vladimir Harkonnen sits on the throne at Castle Caladan. He's kept on a tight leash by the face dancers, so he has no real power. The face dancers seemed much more interested in their young Gola of Paul Atreides, the one they called Paolo. He was their real prize. Their leader Crone said that this planet and the restored castle existed for the sole purpose of triggering Paolo's memories. The Baron was just a means to an end, of secondary importance in the Kwisatz Haderach matter. He resented the Atreides brat for it. The boy was only 8 and still had much to learn from his mentor, though the Baron hadn't yet determined what the face dancers really wanted. Some bad news on the Ataka. There's a saboteur on board. 3 unborn Gola babies, one of which was going to be Gurney Halleck, and their axetal tanks, the woman who housed them, have been killed. Shiana is suspicious of one of the sisters, Garimi. Remember, she was against this Gola project. She was prepared to kill the baby Leto, lest he become a tyrant again. But since Leto and Paul are already living Golas, what would the point be of sabotaging the lesser important Golas? She argues. Eventually, Shiana asks her help with finding the real culprit, using the Truthsayers and the last of the Truth Trance drug. Shiana uses her other memory to ask Serena Butler, one of the killed baby Golas, who it could have been. Serena's voice interjected, full of sadness. A liar can hide behind barricades, but all barricades eventually fall. You will have other opportunities to discover the murderer. There is sure to be more sabotage. After questioning everyone on board the ship, not a single person seemed to be connected with the murderous incident. Duncan and Teg used their Mentat skills to check and recheck the list of people aboard, yet they could find no errors. No one had evaded questioning. Sitting across from Shiana in the otherwise empty interrogation room, Duncan steeples his fingers. There are 2 possibilities. Either the saboteur is capable of deceiving a truthsayer, or someone we don't know about is hiding aboard the Ithaca. Searching the no-ship presents a challenge because the Ithaca was the size of a small city, more than a kilometer long and hundreds of decks high, each filled with passages, chambers, and hidden doors. Meanwhile, on Chapter House, the Yonit Matres aren't happy with Mabella offering obliterators, the weapons, to the Ixians, but she feels that they're the only ones who can decipher the technology and make more for the war. She feels that it's pointless to keep secrets and it will only serve to strengthen the enemy. So Mabella eventually gives some obliterators to the Ixians, and then she travels to Junction at the main guild shipyards. She wants more ships, and the Sisterhood has enough stores of melange that she's confident that she can trade. The guild wants to negotiate with the thinking machines, with the enemy, because according to them, trade needs to continue. Administrator Rental Gorus tells Mubella, our common enemy must be rational. We have therefore dispatched emissaries and negotiators out to the war zone. We will find the thinking machines and make our proposal. The guild would prefer to continue its commerce regardless of the outcome of this disagreement. Mubella gasped. Are you insane? Omnis seeks the extermination of all humanity. That includes you. You overstate your case, Mother Commander. Some of our emissaries will, I believe, achieve our goal. Mubella is confused and frustrated that the guild keeps thinking about profit when an Armageddon is pretty much imminent. For the guild, it seems to be business as usual. Gorus tells Mubella that they don't have enough navigators to man the ships that she demands, so they'll have to use the Ixian mathematical compilers. Mubella doesn't care as long as she gets her functioning ships. Fast forward to 6 months, which is how long the Ixians have been studying the obliterators. Mubella hasn't heard anything from them. The enemy ships are moving though, destroying planets in their wake. Some of the inhabitants have managed to evacuate, and Mubella has been given statements from the refugees who were fleeing from the Fringe to the old empire. Finally, an Ixian engineer arrives on Chapter House with some news. Our best engineers and scientists have deconstructed and analyzed the sample obliterators you provided. Mabella leaned forward, giving him her full attention. And you can reproduce them? Better than that, Mother Commander. His confident smile held no warmth at all. It was simply an imitation of a facial expression. Our fabricators understand the underlying concept of the weapon and are able to concentrate its destructive power. Previously, it required several Honored Matre battleships deploying multiple obliterators to kill a planet. With our enhanced weapon, a single ship can launch enough firepower to do what was done to Arrakis. He gave a perfunctory shrug. Imagine what such an energy release would do to enemy battleships. They demanded payment and spice. Mabella isn't sure why Ixians would want payment and spice, and she isn't sure that she can meet that supply with their fledgling spice operation, but she eventually agrees when the Ixian engineer refuses to accept anything else. This engineer turned out to be Crone, a face dancer. Crone found it ironic to demand payment and spice, since Ix had devoted so much technological effort into installing navigation machines and guild ships. Thanks to the mathematical compilers, Melange was basically obsolete when it came to folding space, and the navigators were fading swiftly. But by insisting on such a huge payment and spice alone, and then hoarding the commodity, Crone would remove a large amount of it from the market, making it even rarer. That in turn would force more and more ships to convert to Ixian navigation compilers, because the guild could not support the Melange needs of their navigators. Before long, with no way of supporting their own navigators, the whole spacing guild would fall under Crone's control. He had worked it all out in exquisite detail. On the no ship, Tafir Hawat tells his mentor Teg that Yui might know more than he's letting on about the murders. Teg is a little taken aback. Yui is only 13. He does not have his memories back. Maybe the weakness is in his blood. Bashar, we know that somebody committed sabotage. The young man sounded disappointed in himself for allowing it to happen. Even the real Tafir Hawat didn't find the traitor in House Atreides before he betrayed us to the Harkonnens. That traitor was Yui. Teg says that he'll keep that in mind. Wellington Yui had a powerful need to be forgiven. The blank spot in his mind was filled with guilt. He was just a Gola and only 13, but he knew he had done terrible things. His own history clung to him like tar to his shoe. In his first life, he had broken his sick conditioning. He had failed his wife Wana by allowing the Harkonnens to use her as a pawn, and had betrayed Duke Leto, bringing about the Atreides' downfall on Arrakis. To his credit, the original Yui had given Jessica and Paul the means to survive in the desert after the Harkonnens stormed Arrakeen. He facilitated their escape, but was that enough for redemption? Could it possibly be? On Chapter House, Mabella gets some bad news from her daughter Bashar Janice Idaho. A disease has been set out by the Thinking Machine's scouts. The plague spread rapidly across all continents. The current viral strains are far worse than anything previously encountered, more deadly than even the legendary plagues during the Butlerian Jihad. It has wiped out a population of over 300 million. Mabella decides after this not to stay on Chapter House, so she plans to go to the worlds at the edge of the war zone to gather intel, basically. At last, Waf was ready to release his new worms, and Buzzle was a convenient ocean planet on Edric's standard trade route, a perfect test bed. The Highliner appeared above the liquid sapphire world where tiny islands dotted the expansive ocean. Buzzle's oceans were deep and fertile, a large zone where the genetically altered worms would thrive, provided they survived their initial baptism. Waf knew that the creatures had the same internal metabolic reactions as a traditional sandworm. Therefore, they should still produce spice, but Waf didn't know what kind of spice or how it would be harvested. He stepped back, interlocking his greyish fingers. That wasn't his problem or concern. He had done as Edric commanded. He only wanted the worms back. It had taken more than a year out of his accelerated lifetime, but if Waf succeeded in resurrecting God's messengers, his destiny would be complete. Sample tanks were loaded aboard the small transport. Waf did not usually leave the safe confines of the Highliner, but he insisted on accompanying the crew down to the open sea. It was his experiment, and he wanted to be there in person to make sure that the worms were released properly. On the no-ship, Shayana steps into one of the worms named Monarch's mouth. In there, she is given an important message by the worm and it seeps into her consciousness. And after this encounter, she's sure of what she needs to do. 2 days later, she decides that it's time to waken all of the Golas, bring back the memories of who they once were. They decide to start with Yui, who they deem the least valuable Gola. He'll be the test. Shayana does her sexual imprint against Yui's will, and he painfully gets his memories back, and he damns the witches, he calls the sisters that, for putting him through this. The Baron, Paolo, and the face dancers are still on Caladan until one day Crone tells the Baron that it's time for them to leave. You and Paolo will depart Caladan and never return. The Great War is proceeding, and the Evermind has decided that he needs the Kwisatz Haderach back close to him. Ominous wants you to complete the boy's preparation under his direct supervision in the heart of the Machine Empire. You will depart for Synchrony as soon as the ship is ready. On the Ithaca, the Telaxu Master Scytale is finally dying, and the younger Scytale's memories are unlocked. Abruptly, the Telaxu youth felt something changing inside, followed by an explosion between his temples. He cried out from the excruciating pain. At first, he thought he was dying himself, but instead of being swallowed in blackness, he felt new thoughts burning like wildfire across his consciousness. Memories streamed past in a blur, but Scytale locked onto each one, absorbing it again and reprocessing it into the synapses of his brain. The precious memories returned to where they had always belonged. His father's death had opened the barriers. At last, Scytale retrieved what he was supposed to know, the critical databank of his Telaxu master, all the ancient secrets of his race. Instilled with pride and a new sense of dignity, he rose to his feet. Wiping away warm tears, he looked down at the discarded copy of himself on the bed. It was nothing more than a withered husk. He no longer needed the old man. Mubella is standing on a reef in Buzzle. Remember, she's traveling from planet to planet, surveying the damage left by the thinking machines. Quite suddenly, something large and serpentine emerged from the depths near the splashing creatures. An eyeless head rose above the waves, its round mouth flashing crystalline teeth. The head quested around, fin-edged gill, flaps sensing vibrations like a sea serpent from ancient legends. Mubella caught her breath. To her amazement, it resembled a sandworm from Arrakis, though only about 10 meters long and with adaptations that enabled it to live in water. Impossible. A sea worm? Now that Stilgar and Liet had their Gola memories back, they had become the No Ship's experts on extreme recycling, making the most of their reduced resources. The Ithaca's life support systems had been designed by geniuses out in the scattering, descendants of those who had survived the horrific famine times. The highly efficient technology could serve passengers and crew for long periods, even in the face of the increasing population, but not in the face of deliberate sabotage. Long ago, and when he and Liet had first known each other, the two had shared many adventures fighting the nefarious Harkonnens. Like his father, Liet had led a double life, delivering grand dreams to the desert people while acting as imperial planetologist and judge of the change. Liet was also the father of Cheney. While the Fremen girl's Gola did not remember him yet, he remembered her, and he looked at Cheney with a strange, age-worn love. The sabotage is still continuing on the Ithaca in different ways, so everybody is extra vigilant. This enemy has somehow eluded all of their surveillance systems. The saboteur seemed to know exactly where and when to strike. An endless succession of little breakdowns and small accidents, each taking its toll, ran the ship's company to exhaustion. One time, images detected what appeared to be a man as he moved furtively down a corridor near a bank of oxygen scrubber units and air circulating machines. Dressed in dark clothing and a tight-fitting hood that covered most of his face, he carried a long silver knife and a pry bar, and his body leaned forward against the heavy airflow. Then, like liquid flowing around a corner, the man slipped into the central circulation chamber where great fans blasted air through a system of arteries in the nose ship, pushing it through thick curtains of matted fibers coated with biogels to remove impurities. With sudden fury, the unidentifiable saboteur slashed and hacked at the porous filter mats, ripping them from their frames and destroying their ability to purify air. After completing this mayhem, the saboteur turned to flee. Not a single frame of the images showed the face. It wasn't even absolutely clear whether the hooded vandal was male or female. By the time the security personnel rushed into the area, the saboteur had vanished into the howling recirculated wind. Duncan did not need to whisper the obvious answer, faced answer. He studied all records of the kamikaze. The saboteur was trying to destroy their air and food supply. We get a description of the planet Synchrony, where Baron Harkonnen and Paolo are going to be. The metropolis before them was beautiful in an industrial and metallic way. Sharp angles, smooth curves, and a great deal of energy as structures moved and flashed like a perfectly tuned machine. Angular buildings and windowless towers covered every square meter of ground. The Baron saw no offensive greenery, no gaudy flowers or landscaping, not a leaf, blossom, or blade of grass. Synchrony was a bustling symbol of productivity, along with concomitant profits and political power, if thinking machines ever figured out how to pay attention to such things. Maybe Vladimir Harkonnen would show ominous how it was done. After the long journey from Caladan, the Baron and Paolo rode a tram to the shifting center of the machine city. They're greeted by a visitor then. A mist rose and congealed in the shape of a large man, a faceless ghost-like figure. The foggy form, nearly twice the height of a grown man, stopped in front of them and moved its arms to make a swirl of icy air that smelled of metal and oil. Within the countenance, two glowing eyes became apparent. From a misty mouth, a deep voice said, "So this is our Kwisatz Haderach." Paolo asks this ghost-like figure if its name is Omnius, and it answers that it speaks for the Evermind. Waff arrives back on Buzzle to see his growing worms, and it delights him to know that the Bene Gesserit don't know where the serpentine creatures came from. At one point he sees one. The worm was 20 meters long, a tremendous rate of growth for such a short time. He was impressed. If the creatures were producing as rapidly as they were growing, the oceans of Buzzle would soon be teeming with them. He couldn't ask for more. The angry witches had led hunting parties, taking boats out onto the water, guided by vengeful amphibians. They begged Chapter House for weapons to kill the sea worms, but with enemy forces attacking hundreds of fringe worlds and the industries of Junction and X consuming most of the new sisterhood's resources, they were stretched far too thin. After killing one of the worms, Waff finds that the creature is saturated in extremely concentrated spice. As we know, Erasmus and Omnius are on the planet Synchrony, and Omnius announces that they verified the location of Chapter House, and scouts have already been sent there to unleash a plague. We learn more then about the nemesis of the Evermind, the Oracle of Time. What remained of Norma Senva's ancient corporeal form was confined inside a chamber that had been built and modified around her during thousands of years, but her mind knew no physical boundaries. She was only tenuously connected to flesh, a biological generator of pure thought, the Oracle of Time. Her mental links to the fabric of the universe gave her the ability to travel anywhere along infinite possibilities. She could see the future and the past, but not always with perfect clarity. Her brain was such that she could touch the infinite and almost comprehend it. Her nemesis, the Evermind, had laid down a vast electronic network throughout the fabric of space, a complex tachyon roadmap that most people could not see. Omnius used it as a net to sift for his prey, but so far he had not managed to snare the No Ship. Remember in the last book she assisted Duncan to fold into No Space? She has since lost track of the No Ship though, and she has been trying to relocate them. She's always feared that the thinking machines would come back. The Ithaca has now folded into space and it has reached the perimeter of another star system. This looks like a place that they might be able to settle, but Duncan and the rest are cautious. What if this is exactly what the saboteurs want? What if it's a trap? He does say that his instincts must have brought him there for a reason though. Some of them go down to the planet, replenish their resources and do some exploring. This new planet is pretty dry and desert-like, and before long, the Ithaca's inhabitants see people on this planet. Because of the sand and dust, the people's faces are covered with cloths and filters. Stilgar suggests that they teach them how to make real still suits. It's curious though that the people choose to settle here because there are forests and cities close by. Shayana asks these nomads, which is what they're called, if they've seen any of their Bene Gesserit sisters, but one of the nomads says they're all dead. Just then, the old man brings out a knife, meaning to attack. Shayana fights and overpowers some of her attackers, but they're unable to get away and they're captured. One of their capturers, the old man, introduces himself as Var. He says that the Bene Gesserit came to their planet many years ago and delivered their experimental demon creatures, which have been turning their beautiful land into a desert. When we finally realized what those women were doing, we killed them all, but too late. Our planet is dying now and we will fight to protect what's left of it. Crone, who is currently on Junction, expresses secret desperate joy at the navigators dying in their tanks, because this means that the Highliners are brought back to the junction to be fitted with one of the Ixian mathematical compilers. The Face Dancer is currently in disguise as an Ixian inspection engineer. Mobella's defensive fleet was growing with remarkable speed, but Crone knew that even these efforts would not be very effective against the sheer size and scope of Omnius's military, which had been thousands of years in the making. The fabrication of the X, also controlled by the Face Dancers, were still delaying the development and modification of the obliterator weapons upon which the Sisterhood's defense relied. And since every new guild ship was controlled by an Ixian mathematical compiler rather than a navigator, the Mother Commander and her allies would have many surprises in store. Waff asks Edric to take him to Rarkus. He says that he's done the work demanded of him by the guild navigators. Rarkus is where his last body perished, and he wants to go on a pilgrimage, work on his last sandworm specimens, and maybe try and reintroduce them to Rarkus. Disaster, meanwhile, strikes Chapter House. Then the Verlin Plague reached Chapter House. The first cases appeared among the male workers. 7 men were struck down so swiftly that their dying expressions showed more surprise than pain. In the Great Hall, where younger sisters dined, the disease also spread. The virus was so insidious that the most contagious period occurred a full day before any symptoms manifested. Thus, the epidemic had already sunk its claws into the most vulnerable before the Sisterhood even knew that the threat existed. Hundreds perished within the first 3 days, more than 1,000 by the end of the week. After 10 days, the victims were beyond counting. Support staff, teachers, visitors, off-world merchants, cooks and kitchen help, even failed reverend mothers, all fell like stalks of wheat under the Grim Reaper's scythe. The sisters could use their bodily defenses to drive off the plague, but those who hadn't gone through the spice agony, they will die. Meanwhile, on this half-desert planet, Stilgar and Liet are talking with the nomads, trying to help them reclaim their home from the worms. Stilgar tries to get them to see the value of spice, but of course the nomads don't need it to survive. By the way, this new planet is named Kelso. At one point, the group agrees to help the nomads destroy one of the worms. They track one down and they blast it with water and it dies. Waff finally arrives on Rarkus. When he first glimpsed Rarkus, the bleak ruins brought dismay to Waff's heart. But when Edric's Highliner deposited him and his small team of guild assistants there, he experienced the joy of setting foot on the desert planet again. He could feel the holy calling deep inside his bones. In his previous lifetime, he had stood on these sands, face to face with the Prophet. With Shayana and Reverend Mother Odrade, he had ridden a giant worm out to the ruins of Sietch Tabar, but his Gola memories were corrupted and uncertain, riddled with gaps. Edric moved his Highliner away from the ruins of Rarkus, no longer concerned with the Telexu master. Waff had served his purpose. More important, the Oracle of Time had summoned all surviving navigators, and Edric would give them joyous news. With the sea worms obviously thriving on Buzzle, there would be plenty of ultra spice for the taking. The unusual concentrated form might even be superior to the original spice. A frighteningly potent melange to keep navigators alive without the meddling, greedy administrative faction or the witches of Chapter House. Freedom. Before he could travel towards a scheduled rendezvous, however, the emptiness rippled around him. When Edric studied the distortions, he realized what they were. Moments later, scores of guild ships appeared like bucket shots in space, winking through fold space and emerging forward and back, above and below, to surround his Highliner completely. He realized that these were new guild ships guided by Ixian mathematical compilers. Finally, a voice spoke, flat and dull in timbre, yet unnervingly confident. "We require your cargo of sea worm spice. We will board your ship for inspection." Though Edric did not recognize him, a man wearing appropriate guild insignia marched along the decks and ascended to the restricted level, brushing aside all security barriers. "We have learned the intensity of this substance and believe it to be a remedy for our difficult situation. We will take it to the heart of the thinking machine empire." Edric says no, but the guard crushes his tank and it starts to crack. He collapses to the floor of his tank and eventually suffocates. The bland-faced man stepped closer to the shattered wall, and his features metamorphosed. Crone said to his Face Dancer companions, "Take the concentrated spice. With this substance, Omnius will awaken his Kwisatz Haderach." Edric continued to have great breaths, but barely a scent of melange remained. By the time the computer-controlled guild ships got into formation in space, he could barely keep from slumping into unconsciousness. The opposing vessels opened fire. Edric's Highliner exploded before he could utter a curse. Back on the Ataka, Duncan is still wondering what happened to the others. It had been 2 days now without a word from Teg or Shayana and their team. If their group was simply meeting with the natives, someone should have checked in by now. He closed his eyes, not wanting to see the spreading desert that looked like a sweeping knife wound across the continent. I will not ignore this. Duncan summoned Tufir Hawat, as well as Garimi, who had recently returned to the no ship with all of her flying craft after reloading the Ataka stores. Duncan stood when they arrived. "We are going to rescue the landing party," he announced, "and we're going to do it now. I don't know what kind of military force those people have down there, but we'll stand against it if the Bashar is in trouble." Duncan goes to retrieve the others from the nomads' custody, but Stilgar and Lietkynes want to stay. They would like to put their talents to use on this desert planet. They want to teach the people to make still suits, even ride sandworms, teach them how to survive the desert. Shayana isn't happy about this because she needs them to fight against their enemy. The rabbi and his people also decide that they'll be staying. They've long since wanted to find a place to settle anyway. Garimi and more than 100 sisters also asked to be left off the no ship permanently. The leader of the nomads refuses the sisters though. As he said, they let the sisters settle there once before, and the sisters destroyed their home, putting them in their current predicament. Not again. The rabbi himself also decides to stay on the Ithaca because he feels an obligation to Rebecca, whom he refuses to leave. By the way, it's pointed out later in the book that even though the other Axetal tanks were murdered in the sabotage, Rebecca miraculously survived the attack. But it wasn't really clear to me what condition she's actually in. Anyway, even though the rabbi will be remaining on the no ship, he allows his people, the Jews, to settle on Kelso. The epidemic on Chapter House is finally burning itself out, but it has claimed many lives. Mubella orders spice to be distributed to the survivors. Though Mubella desperately needed every gram of spice to pay the guild and the Ixians, her sisters needed it more. She then sees on the list of casualties her own daughter that she shared with Duncan Idaho, Gianna. Only 2 daughters remained now, Janice and Tanidia. Janice was off at the battlefront fighting thinking machines, while her sister Tanidia, not knowing the identity of her parents, had been sent to join the Missionaria. Though both of them face risks, they might at least avoid contracting the horrific plague. 2 of my children dead, she said aloud, though the messenger did not understand. Oh, what would Duncan think of me? Mubella set the report aside. She closed her eyes for a moment, drew a deep breath and straightened herself. Pointing to the name on the list of victims, she said, "Take me to her." The messenger glanced down, ran a quick assessment. The bodies in that column have been hauled off to the spaceport. Thopter loads of them are taking off right now. Hurry, I must try to see her. Mubella rushed out of the hall, glancing back to be certain the young woman was right behind her. Though the Mother Commander felt disturbingly numb, she had to do this. Mubella means to accompany her daughter's body into the dunes. She's heartbroken, but she still hasn't lost her resolve. The thinking machines have found a cruel and effective way to destroy our human weapons, but we are not easily disarmed. The no ship had flown away from the turmoil of the planet Kelso, leaving behind some of their people, some of their hopes and possibilities. On that world, Duncan had taken a great risk, daring to leave the no ship for the first time in decades. Had he revealed his presence? Would the enemy be able to find him now, seizing upon that clue? It was possible. Though he decided not to cower and hide, Duncan did not intend to bring possible destruction to all the innocent people on this planet. He would make another jump, cover his tracks. And so the Ataka had risked another unguided plunge through folded space. That was 3 months ago. Shayana, meanwhile, has decided to grow another Gola, although she refuses to say who it is. Since losing Stilgar and Liet on Kelso, she felt it was necessary. She also tried to arrange the awakening of Tufir Hawat's memories, but it didn't work, and instead sent him into convulsions. Because he's a sick doctor with some of his memories back, Yui does have some special access on the no ship, and one day he finds out who Shayana is cooking up in the latest Axetal tank, Peter de Vries, the evil Mentat who did Baron Vladimir Harkonnen's bidding. Because Bene Gesserits liked to play with dangerous toys, resurrecting people to serve as chess pieces in their great game. He knew the sort of questions they would pursue, just to satisfy their infernal curiosity. What was the genetic makeup of Peter de Vries? Was the genetic makeup of Peter de Vries corrupt, or was he evil because he had been twisted by the Telaxu? Who better to think like an enemy than a Harkonnen? Was there any evidence to suggest that the new Peter de Vries would turn out evil as before, if he were not exposed to the corruptive influence of the Baron? He remembered being forced to watch Wanna endure her endless torture at the hands of the vile Mentat, and the man thrusting a knife deep into his back, grinding the blade. Peter de Vries. Days later, Yui entered the medical center and walked towards the single pregnant tank. This was just an innocent baby at the moment. Even if it was de Vries, this Gola child had committed none of the crimes of the original. But he will. He is twisted, evil, malicious. The sisters would raise him and insist on triggering his memories. Indirectly, he had caused de Vries' death the first time around by giving the poisonous gas tooth to Duke Leto, who bit down on it in the Mentat's presence. Yui decides that de Vries has to die. Perspiration formed on his brow as he crossed the room. With the sharp-eyed Bene Gesserit guard watching him, he could not delay, or the damned witches might detect his uneasiness, his nervous movements. Bringing out his device, Yui turned a dial as if to recalibrate it, then inserted its probe into the pregnant tank, as he would do in taking a biological sample. Thus, he easily administered a lethal dosage of fast-acting poison. So far, no one suspected a thing. By the way, he's done this knowing that Hawat and Teg will check the surveillance feed and he'll be caught. Despite this knowledge, Yui was content with himself for the first time since his reawakening. At last, he savored the elusive taste of redemption. Now that he possessed the sample of the Ultra Spice, Crone knew exactly what lived in the fertile seas of Buzzle. The Navigator certainly had an unexpected scheme there, releasing a new breed of melange-producing worms. He needed to go there and see for himself. He starts to think a bit about his plans for the future. All enemies of the Face Dancers would fall. He would see to that. The Lost Helaxu and the original masters had already been erased. The Ixians were in Crone's pocket. Next would come the Sisterhood, the Guild, and all of humanity. Finally, when he and his minions defeated the thinking machines, nothing would remain but the Face Dancers, and that would be enough. On the Ataka, the death of the Axolotl tank with the Peter de Vries Gola fetus is known to Teg, Duncan, and Hawat. They're doing a sweep of the area trying to collect intel. Presently, Teg received a surveillance holotube from one of the Bene Gesserits. I will scan every second. There must be some piece of evidence pointing to the traitor among us. There's no need. I killed the Gola, a young man's voice. All of them spun to look at a grim-faced Dr. Wellington Yui. I had to. Tafir moved swiftly to seize him by the arm, and Yui did not resist. He stood firm, ready to face the questions that would be thrown at him. You can punish me, but I couldn't allow you to spawn another twisted Mentat. Peter de Vries would have only caused bloodshed and pain. Turns out, though, that Yui was wrong, even though he did run a genetic comparison. The Gola fetus was not Peter de Vries, it was Duke Leto. Jessica is shocked and heartbroken by this. Yui killed the Duke again? Anyway, another instance of sabotage occurs while Yui is being imprisoned and being interrogated. So everybody aboard the No Ship knows for sure now that Yui isn't the saboteur. The Bashar himself made the announcement. Explosive mines have been dispersed from the sealed armory. 8 of the 112, certainly enough to cause severe damage to the ship. The mines, Teg repeated. Back on Chapter House, they were placed around the ship as a self-destruct mechanism in case Duncan or anyone else tried to steal it. Now, 8 of them are gone. If they are missing, they might have been dumped out into space, all planted around the ship like time bombs, Duncan said. I suspect the latter, and our saboteur has further plans. Meanwhile, for WAF, every investigation of Arrakis yielded the same results. Only a few insignificant pockets of its ecosystem had survived. The planet was empty and haunted, yet it seemed to have its own will to live. Against all odds and science, Arrakis still clung to its sparse atmosphere, its gasps of moisture. WAF decides to free 8 worms onto Arrakis. One of the Ixians, the chief fabricator, Shayama Sen, is on Chapter House to meet with Mubella. Chief fabricator, you have had 3 years to duplicate the obliterators we provided, but all we've received in exchange for our melange payments are reports on your tests and promise after promise. The enemy has destroyed more than 100 planets, and their battleships keep coming. Chapter House itself was nearly eradicated by the recent plague. After some back and forth, and mostly stalling by Sen, they come to an agreement to have the obliterators installed onto the no ships immediately. During the time that he and Paolo had lived on Synchrony, the Baron had lost awe and fear of the thinking machines. They seemed plodding and grandiose, full of redundancy and very little impulsivity. Since Omnius thought he needed Paolo, along with the Baron, to keep Paolo in line, the two were safe enough. Even so, the Baron felt a need to show some backbone and turn the circumstances to his own benefit. Leto II is having a difficult time. I was the God Emperor, the tyrant. I created the Golden Path, but with my memories locked away, I don't truly understand what it is. Despite all he had learned about his original lifetime, Leto felt like nothing more than a 12-year-old who had never been asked to be reborn. He decides to go and visit the worms on board the no ship. He makes it into the hold that houses them. These worms were his descendants, each a nugget of his former awareness. We are the same. Leto beckoned them. Although his Gola cells hadn't yet released memories of the thousands of years in his original lifetime, these sandworms possessed buried memories as well. Are you dreaming in there? Am I in there? Tafir Hawat tries to get Leto to leave the hold, telling him that he's in danger. Tafir, they won't harm me. And I feel as if I could make them go away. But they are deeply disturbed. Something about you? Leto sensed something here and he didn't understand. Simultaneously, the worms shot like battering rams towards the two young men on the dune. Tafir bolted away from Leto and lost his footing on the soft surface. Leto tried to go towards him, but the largest worm exploded up between them, scattering sand and dust. Another beast loomed on the other side of the transfixed Tafir, stretching its sinuous body into the air. Tafir let out a shuddering, gut-wrenching scream. It didn't sound at all like the Gola friend Leto had known. It didn't even sound human. The sandworms struck Tafir, but they did not simply devour him. As if in vindictive anger, the largest sandworm slammed down on him, smashing the young man's body into the sand. The next worm reared up and rolled over the already broken Tafir Hawat. For good measure, a third worm crushed the lifeless form. Then the trio of worms backed away as if proud of what they'd done. As Leto goes over to Tafir, he notices that the lifeless body is not Tafir's at all, but a face dancer. Shayana and Duncan decide to keep the discovery of the face dancer a secret for now while they try to determine if there are any other face dancers on board the no ship. Duncan posits that if Tafir was a face dancer baby Gola, then it could be that all the babies are face dancers. He summons Saitel, who is his prime suspect. They start to question him because if these weren't baby Golas with face dancer DNA planted in them by the Tlaxu secretly, then how did a face dancer get aboard if not grown from the face dancer cells in your Nullentropy capsule? Sheena asked. The face dancer could already have been posing as one of us when we left Chapter House, Duncan mused. How carefully did you check all of the original 150 who rushed aboard during the escape? Teg shook his head. But why wait more than 2 decades to strike? It makes no sense. A sleeper agent, perhaps, Shiana suggested? Or could the face dancer have been someone else for a long time and only recently replaced Tafir? Anyway, Saitel suggests coming up with a way to test if someone is a face dancer, and obviously also they're going to test all the Gola babies. Around this time, Jessica also gets all of her old memories back. Shayana and some of the leadership gather some of the passengers to tell them that they have discovered a face dancer in their ranks. She believes that there may be others in the room with them. Without warning, Saitel activated his high-pitched whistle emitter. A shrill tone warbled up and down, intense but faint, above the range of most human hearing. The original face dancers had once communicated with the Tlaxu in a coded whistling language, a secret set of programming notes burned into their neurological structure. Saitel believed the irresistible noise would make any face dancer lose his disguise, at least temporarily. Suddenly, out in the tiers of seats, the old rabbi flickered and his body convulsed. His leathery face shifted and smoothed behind his beard. He let out a cry of surprised outrage and lunged to his feet. Now the old man was unexpectedly supple, wiry, and vicious. His face was flat with sunken eyes and a pug nose, like a bear's skull made of half-melted wax. Face dancer, somebody shouted. The rabbi became a whirlwind and threw himself against the Bene Gesserits. In the ensuing chaos, he kills 2 sisters. Duncan glanced from Yui and Teg to Shayana. The connection is obvious to me now. Tafir Hawat and the rabbi. Why didn't I see it? Shayana caught her breath as she suddenly realized the same thing. Both went down to the planets of the handlers. Duncan nodded. Hawat and the rabbi were alone together during the hunt of the honored matres. You all had to fight your way back to the lighter after you discovered that the handlers were face dancers. Of course, Shayana's face was grave. Those 2 came running in from the forest at the last moment. It seems they didn't escape the handlers after all. So the original rabbi and Tafir, Duncan began, both dead long ago, replaced by face dancers on the planet, and their bodies discarded during the hunt. The Rabbi face dancer makes it to the navigation bridge of the nose ship where Garimi is. He changes his form into a futar and snaps Garimi's neck. He means to alert his thinking machine masters, so he triggers a locator beacon. By the time Shiana, Duncan, and Teg reach the bridge, they are locked out. Alia says that she's small enough to get inside through the vents. She's only 4 years old at this point. She finally crawls through the vents and makes it there and catches the face dancer off guard. Using the nail gun that she has with her, she shoots the face dancer in both eyes, and she shoots one needle into his neck artery. She unlocks the hatch and lets everybody else in. Duncan hurried to the nose ship's controls to assess what the false rabbi had done. He extended his senses and was dismayed to see the deadly strands of the shimmering net suddenly appear and intensify all around them. Unbreakable. The trap was bright enough, powerful enough that everybody could see it. Teg rushed to a scanner station. Duncan, ships approaching. A lot of them. The face dancer has brought us right to the doorstep of the enemy. We're tagged and the net has locked onto us. After all these years, we're caught in the strands. Duncan swept his gaze across all of them. At least we're about to find out who our enemy really is. On Chapter House, Mubella is accepting the many refugees who are escaping the thinking machine wards. She also gets news of the ultra spice that's been produced by the worms on Buzzle, and she guesses that this is a guild experiment. Crone arrives on Synchrony, this new machine world, and he brings with him some of the potent ultra spice. He tells the Evermind, which has now taken the shape of the old man and woman again, that this will unlock Paolo's prescience and they'll have their Kwisatz Haderach. Omnius asks them what they're supposed to do with 2 Kwisatz Haderachs, because after all this time, the nose ship has finally fallen into their trap. And they know, or their projections tell them, that there is a Kwisatz Haderach on board. A gossamer of jeweled colours closed around the Ataka. The nose ship's engine strained but could not break away. Scrambling to reassert control over the helm and drag themselves free of the strange bonds, Duncan powered up the Holtzman engines, preparing to rip a hole through the glimmering mesh. It was their only way out. He searched frantically for holes or weak spots in the powerful structure, but found nothing to suggest the slightest defect, no frayed point that might allow them to escape. He would try brute force then. The enemy ships then start firing at them, killing their engines, and Teg says that he knows how to fix it. He uses his super speed to find all of the engines and the parts that he needs, and he starts his repairs. In his time frame, this has taken an hour, but only a few seconds have passed in real time. Next, days pass for him, minutes in real time, as he continues to work and replenish his body with calories that he needs at these high speeds. Duncan, meanwhile, is on the navigation bridge when it looks like Teg's efforts are paying off. Suddenly, the control deck systems began to glow. Green indicator lights winked on by themselves. One after the other, systems came back online. Sensing movement, Duncan snapped his head to the left. The Bashar materialized in front of him, but it was a different Miles Teg. Not the young Gola whom Duncan had raised and awakened, but a horribly drained man, as desiccated and ancient as an ambulatory mummy. Teg looked wrung out and ready to collapse. He had exerted himself enough through time, far beyond the point where a normal human would have already died. Boards active. His gasping voice cost him more energy than he had left. Go! Duncan gives it his best effort, but he's unable to get the Ataka out of there. They're caught. A message formed on the primary screen of the bridge, a powerful transmission from the surrounding battleships. Even in his stunned sorrow, Duncan was surprised to see the true face of the enemy at last. The smooth flow metal face of a sentient machine appeared on the screen. You are our prisoners. Your vessel is no longer capable of independent flight. We will deliver you to the Evermind Omnius. Thinking machines. Miles Teg had given his life to save them twice now. He had used up his entire lifespan this time. Anyway, the thinking machine vessels take the battered nose ship to Synchrony. Mubella finds out that her ship's obliterators are useless, they don't work, and suddenly their ships go dead in space, shutting down. Even though some of the sisters oversaw their manufacture, it appears that the obliterators have somehow been neutralized. A coldness froze her heart and spread into her bloodstream. These weapons had been built over the course of years by the Ixians, at a cost in melange that nearly bankrupted the sisterhood. She had been duped, and her fleet had been castrated by the Ixians before the battle could even begin. On Synchrony, the Baron boards the captured nose ship and he stabs Alia to death when he sees her. The Baron laughed and the face dancers hurried him away. When he looked at his escort, the shapeshifters showed disapproval at what he had done. What? I don't have to justify my reasons to you. At least that abomination is gone now. Gone, you say? A little girl's loud titter like breaking glass inside his skull. Gone. You can't discard me so easily. I was rooted inside your head before the Gola was ever born. The voice grew louder. Now I shall torment you more than ever. You leave me no choice but to serve as your conscience, grandfather. Shiana eventually gets an audience with the Evermind, and Serena Butler from Other Memories speaks through her. The Evermind eventually sends for Paul. Paul demands to know what the Evermind wants. The old woman explained, "Consider all the chaos that has existed over the millennia of your human civilization. Such messy creatures you are. We thinking machines could have done a much neater, more efficient job." The old man approached Paul, "And now that I have you, there is no question of the outcome. The mathematical projection states that the Kwisatz Haderach will change the battle at the end of the universe. Since I control you and the other one, we will now finish this conflict." Erasmus stepped forward to inspect Paul like a scientist examining a valuable specimen. His optic threads glittered. "We know you have the potential within your genes. The challenge lies in determining which Paul Atreides will be the better Kwisatz Haderach." Mubella is still trying to hold ground and fight the encroaching enemy, even though their ships, obliterators, are defective. Suddenly, a female voice thrummed across the comm lines that linked Mubella's defenders. "I am the Oracle of Time, and I bring reinforcements. Mathematical compilers corrupted many guild vessels, but my navigators control these highliners." Navigators? The white-haired administrator gasped in consternation. "We thought they were all dead, starved for spice." The Oracle spoke in a powerful, lilting tone. "And my ships, unlike those made by the traitorous fabricators of Ix, command full armaments. Our obliterators work as designed. We took them from the old Onat Matre ships and hid them away for our own defenses. We intend to use them now." Mubella's face flushed. She had suspected the rebel Onat Matres had possessed many more obliterators than were found, so the navigators had been hiding them all along. The ominous invasion fleet shifted position in response to the navigator reinforcements, but the machines could not comprehend the magnitude of the astonishing opponent they now faced. They did not react in time as the Oracle's highliners spewed out dazzling sunbursts in a flurry of explosions like miniature supernovas. Each incinerating burst of light vaporized entire clusters of overly complacent enemy vessels. This is a victory for now, and Mubella asks the Oracle if they can join forces and fight the enemy together. But the Oracle responds that she's needed on Synchrony. She's located the no ship with Duncan Idaho and the others. This information that Duncan is alive sends Mubella reeling for a second. Paul Atreides finally meets his doppelganger Paolo on Synchronous. Erasmus wants them to fight to death in a duel against each other. Later, the second tells Shayana that they have to go back to the hold where the worms are because they're calling for him. Shai Hulud is calling, and he knows what he needs to do. Shayana wonders if Leto could be the ultimate Kwisatz Haderach. They head to where the worms are, and she asks him if the worms would fight with them against the machines. Leto says that they will follow the path that he sets out for them. He just doesn't know what the path is yet. He does eventually decide, though, that the worms need to be let out there and then. So he and Shayana open the hatch, and they let the worms out. Back to the duel. Whichever of you wins the duel will receive the Ultra Spice, Omnius announced. When the winner consumes it, I will have my true and final Kwisatz Haderach. I can then conclude this wasteful nonsense and begin my real work on remaking the universe. They start their duel, which takes many pages, but eventually Paul is disarmed. He also realizes then that he's not the real Kwisatz Haderach, not the one that Omnius wants. Paolo, still armed with the Emperor's dagger, closes in on him. Wearing a venomous grin, young Paolo swung the gold-hilted dagger around in a perfect arc and, with exquisite slowness, drove the point into Paul's side. He slipped the dagger between his opponent's ribs and kept pushing, shoving the deadly point through Paul's lung and up into his heart. Blood gushed from his wound, and Paul stumbled against the base of the hot fountain. It was a mortal wound, there could be no denying it. The prescient voice in his head hammered at him to no purpose. It seemed to be mocking him. I am not the final Kwisatz Haderach. It was a perfect reproduction of his visions. He lay on the floor, dying as swiftly as his body could allow. Leto, meanwhile, dives into the sand, and he can somehow see without his eyes. He's swimming in the sand. Though still in human form, Leto recalled some of the fantastic power, not from Gola memories, but from the pearl of awareness that the original God Emperor had left within each worm descendant. They remembered, and Leto remembered with them. He takes charge by climbing onto one of them, and so this is his army, and his mind is merged with the largest sandworm, Monarch. On Arrakis, Waf's experiment with the worms is failing. The ones he kept with him in a lab have just died, and when he went to find the ones that he set out into the dunes, he saw that they were dying as well. Waf pressed his forehead against the dusty, dying creature's yielding surface. He had done everything he could. Maybe Arrakis would never again support the behemoth worms. Maybe this was indeed the end. From what he saw with his own eyes, he could not deny that the prophet had truly fallen. When the older and inferior Paul Atreides, Gola, lay dying on the floor, Paolo turned away, pleased with his victory, but far more interested in his other priority. He had proved himself to Omnius and Erasmus. This ultra spice that would unlock all of his prescient abilities was his now. It would elevate him to the next level, to his exalted destiny, as the Baron had taught him for so long. During that time, Paolo had convinced himself that this was what he wanted, brushing aside any nagging qualms or reservations. Paolo takes the ultra spice, and it works a little too well. He's drunk on power as he announces his plans for the New World. Now that I have come into my true power, there is no need for the thinking machine fleet to obliterate the human-inhabited planets. I can control them all. He waved a hand. Oh, we may have to annihilate a minor world or two to demonstrate our strength, or maybe just because we can, but we will keep alive the vast majority of people as fodder. Once we have swallowed up Chapter House, we will open the Sisterhood's breeding records. From there, we will implement my master plan of making brilliant, perfect humans, combining whatever traits I choose. Workers and thinkers, drones, engineers, and occasionally leaders. He spun toward the old man. And you, Omnius, will construct a vast infrastructure for me. If we give our perfect humans too much freedom, they'll mess everything up. We must eliminate the wild, troublesome genetic lines. He says that he'll be the last of the Atreides, and he also finds that the Duncan Idahos have become tedious. After all, it all becomes too much for him. Paolo, who had wanted to be the final Kwisatz Haderach so badly he had killed for it, now became petrified by the utter tedium of his own existence. He knew every breath and pulse point in the entire history and future of the universe. Another nanosecond passed. How could any person endure this? Paolo was trapped in a predetermined path, like a computer's infinite loop. No surprises, choices, or movement. Absolute foreknowledge rendered Paolo entirely irrelevant. He envisioned himself sinking in slow motion to the floor and lying face up, unable to move or speak, unable to even blink his eyes, fossilizing. Then Paolo saw the last and most terrible revelation. He was not the true and final Kwisatz Haderach after all. It was not him. He would never accomplish what he had dreamed. As Leto and his worms burrow beneath the metropolis, causing the buildings of Synchrony to fall, Duncan and the others raid the No Ship's modest armory to do what they can against the enemy. Yui kills the Baron, stabbing him to death, but he can't bring himself to kill Paolo, because he is Paul Atreides. Paul is dying, and Yui thinks that the wound is fatal, that he can't do anything to save Paul, but Jessica urges him not to underestimate himself or Paul. Paul comes to as he hears Jessica and Cheney's voices next to him, and that's when he manages to heal himself. Between his last heartbeats, he searched within himself in the deep and drowning place. He found the knife wound inside his heart, saw the mortal damage, and discovered that his body's defenses were incapable of repairing the grievous injuries on their own. He needed to direct the healing process. Paul brought the cells together and sealed them. Then, droplet by droplet, he began to draw his own blood back from the cavities of his body where it had spilled and reabsorbed it into his tissues. He literally pulled life back into himself. So anyway, he finally wakes up healed, and he has all of Paul's memories again. He also comes back with the knowledge that Duncan Idaho is in fact the Kwisatz Haderach. The Oracle of Time arrives then on Synchrony to speak with Duncan and tells him that not only is he connected with the Golden Path, he's destined to go beyond it. Jessica is curious about how Duncan could have become the Kwisatz Haderach. The Oracle continued, Duncan, with each rebirth, you came closer to completion. Instead of being developed in a breeding program, you went through a process of personal evolution. With every successive incarnation, you acquired more knowledge, skills, and experience, as if a sculptor with a tiny chisel was chipping away at a large block of hard stone, slowly, ever so slowly, fashioning a perfect statue. In your body, you manifested a tachyon evolution, a hyper-fast developmental journey that propelled you toward your destiny. Duncan was the same person again and again, perfecting himself constantly filtering out impurities like passing through a fine mesh strainer to sift out only the best of qualities, leaving him as the one. He allowed himself a secret smile at the irony. He'd succeeded only because of the meddling of the Telaksu, though he was certain that the Masters had never intended to create a savior for humanity. The Oracle tells Duncan that she needs to ensure that the machines don't harm any more humans. This was her job back when she was still human as well, and how she invented the folding space engine. She eventually uses her power to defeat the Evermind. The air in the chamber crackled with clouds of electricity that spread thinner and thinner. As the Oracle wrapped herself superimposed over that of the old man, the two countenances merged into one, hers. The beautiful woman smiled, and the air filled with sparkling hair-fine strands of electricity that she drew around her like an elegant cloak. Then she uprooted herself from reality and vanished into the incomprehensible void, taking with her all traces of Omnius forever. Even after the navigators destroyed the bulk of the enemy fleet in a flurry of unexpected obliterators, a second wave of machine ships advanced towards Chapter House. Oracle, upon locating Duncan, Idaho, and the lost No ship, had promptly taken most of her highliners to Synchrony, only assigning a small percentage to aid in the defenses of other human-inhabited planets. So on Chapter House, Mubella and her fighters noticed something different about the thinking machines that aren't moving in an efficient manner anymore. They just suddenly start to float listlessly in space instead of coming for them. The Oracle had disbanded the fleet, and Omnius was gone. Meanwhile on Synchrony, Duncan overpowers Erasmus, but he doesn't kill him. To end Kralizek and truly change the future requires more than just annihilation of one side or another. At this point, Crone and his face dancers come out and reveal to Erasmus that they've had their own plans all along and the robots were just a means to an end. We've already won, Erasmus. Face dancers control every foothold and you have no place to hide from us. We will rise up across the human planets and on all the machine worlds. We will look back upon the path of destruction and only we will remain. Erasmus says that they've been watching the face dancers all along. Everything that they had planned, the face dancers, was predictable. Remember, it was the Evermind that manufactured these newer versions of face dancers and made them stronger. Erasmus reveals that a failsafe was planted into the face dancers. Crone calls his bluff. Erasmus emitted a poignant sigh. Wrong again. This is my proof. With a precise nod of his burnished head, he triggered the implanted shutdown virus that was genetically buried within each of the customized, enhanced face dancers. Like a toy discarded by a petulant child, the face dancer standing immediately behind Crone crumpled lifeless to the floor, arms and legs akimbo, an expression of momentary shock animating his face before it reverted to its blank slate. Then he kills Crone. Back on Chapter House, Mubella and her fighters are confused by the enemy ships that are just standing there. Do they fire at them? Is it a trap? She decides to fire on the enemy ships, and the enemy ships don't retaliate. Just then, a navigator's voice summons her to Synchrony on the Oracle's orders. Shiana and Leto are surveying some of the damage. They're exhausted even though they've been victorious. Leto decides then that this is it for him. Tears welled in Leto's dark blue eyes. There are so many painful memories from before I took the Sandtrouts as part of me. My father refused to make the choice I did, refused to pay the price in blood for the golden path, but I thought I knew better. Ah, how arrogant we can be in our youth. In front of Leto, the largest worm lifted. Its open mouth looked like a cave full of rich spice. Fortunately, I know how to go back into the dreaming essence of the tyrant, the God Emperor, to the real son of Muad'Dib. With a glance at her, he said, I take my last few sips of humanity. Then he entered the towering mouth and climbed over the more fence of crystalline teeth. Shiana understood what he was doing. She had tried the same thing herself, though ineffectively. The worm engulfed Leto II, closed its mouth and reared back. The boy was gone. Shiana struggled to keep her knees from buckling. She knew she would never see Leto again, though he would be with the worms eternally, merged into Monarch's flesh from the inside, becoming a pearl of awareness once more. Erasmus and Duncan joined so that the data, the knowledge, could flow from Erasmus to Duncan. The mental floodgates opened, filling his mind to bursting with the robot's experiences and coldly factual regimented information, and he began to see things from an entirely alien viewpoint. In an epiphany, he realized that he was the new Evermind, but of an entirely different sort from the original. Erasmus had not deceived him. With eyes that extended to centillions of sensors, Duncan could see all of the enemy ships, the fighting drones, the worker robots, every cog in the awe-inspiring reborn empire, and he could stop everything in its tracks if he wanted to. When Duncan returned to himself in his relatively human body, he looked through his own eyes around the chamber. Erasmus stood before him separate now and smiling with what seemed to be genuine satisfaction. Duncan saw that balance was required, human heart and machine mind. What he had received from Erasmus could become a weapon or a tool. He had to use it properly. It must serve as a synthesis of man and machine. He locked gazes with Erasmus, and this time he and the robot connected without making physical contact. Somehow, the Kwisatz Haderach retained a ghost image of Erasmus within himself, just as Reverend Mothers carried other memories inside. Duncan turned to face Paul and the others. After the Butlerian Jihad, human civilization went too far by completely banning artificial intelligence. But in forbidding any sort of computers, we humans denied ourselves valuable tools. That overreaction created an unstable situation. History has shown that such absolute draconian prohibitions cannot be sustained. Jessica said skeptically, yet eradicating computers for so many generations forced us to grow stronger and become independent. For thousands of years, humanity advanced without artificial constructions to think and decide for us. Duncan suggests that humans and the machines work side by side, with neither enslaving the other. Erasmus turns into an old woman again and asks Duncan to guide her to her death, and Duncan obliges. On Arrakis, Waf has given up on his worm project, but just then, real giant sandworms sprout up from the ground. These sandworms would make Arrakis their own again. He eventually gets engulfed by them, becoming one with his prophet. Mubella finally makes it onto Synchrony, and she and Duncan just stare at each other at first, having been reunited after all this time, after more than 2 decades. She's shocked to hear that he's part machine. After all, the machines had slaughtered trillions of human beings. She tells him that the machines are their mortal enemies. Eventually, the inhabitants of the no ship decide to settle on Synchrony, but Mubella decides that she's going to return to Chapter House. Duncan accompanies her, and she introduces him to one of their daughters, Janice. More than a year had passed on Kelso. The unnatural desert continued to spread as Sandshroud reproduced and commandeered more and more of the planet's water. Though their fight seemed hopeless, Var's commandos stood against the forces that were killing their environment. Stilgar and Liet Kynes did their best to assist in the struggle. Both desert-bred Golas felt that their more important work was to show the natives how they could live in cooperation with the encroaching desert rather than fight it. During the many months since the pair had departed from the no ship, the dry sands had extended much further into the continental forests and plains. Var's camp had moved time after time, retreating from the oncoming dunes, and the desert kept following them. Though they had killed dozens of sandworms using water cannons and moisture bombs, Shai-Hulud was not easily thwarted. The worms grew larger despite all the efforts of the Kelso commandos. One day, Duncan comes to Kelso and he tells Stilgar, Liet, and the nomads that he confronted the enemy and the war is over. He tells them that he can build a barrier to stop the encroachment of the desert so that Shai-Hulud will have his domain and the humans will have theirs. Lady Jessica returns to Caladan with Yui and a young Duke Leto. She intends to be with him again after 2 decades when he's of age. Synchrony has been rebuilt. Shiana got some help from Duncan and the machines for that. And every month new people came to join the Bene Gesserit on Synchrony. Others went to Chapter House. Shiana has also continued the Bene Gesserit's successful breeding program. Paul and a pregnant Cheney are back on Dune. With a small group of determined settlers, he and Cheney had been salvaging the Fremen habitat with their own hands, reclaiming the old ways. In bygone days, he had been the legendary Muad'Dib, leading a Fremen army. Now he was content to be a modern-day Fremen, a leader of 753 people who had established austere homes in the rocks which were on their way to becoming thriving sietches. Catching her by the arm, Paul spun her around and wiped sand from around her eyes and mouth. Then he drew her close and kissed her. Cheney seemed to melt in his arms, laughing. "So you have finally learned how to treat your wife." "My Sihaya," he said as he held her, "I have loved you for 5,000 years. And that is the end of Sandworms of Dune and also the entire Dune series. Thank you for watching.